Fun.
They say a marriage is a partnership, but some people treat it like a hostile takeover. My wife sat me down on a Tuesday night, laid out a color-coded folder, and gave me an ultimatum.
Then.
Put her name on my father's inheritance within 7 days, or Shed walk out the door. She thought she was a game of chess, but she didn't realize I'd been playing for years. She expected a fight.
He expected me to beg.
Instead, I just looked at her, nodded, and let her think Shed already won. Imzak. And this is how the woman who wanted everything ended up with absolutely nothing.
Things it.
I run a small snow removal and site services company out of Greece, right on the edge of Rochester. Winters are brutal plowing commercial lots at 3 in the morning while your fingers go numb from the lake effect wind.
Fuisgrip.
Summers are for landscaping and retaining walls. I built this business from the ground up when I was 24, starting with one beat-up truck and a leaf blower. I didn't have a head start.
Only didn't have a safety net.
Everything I have, I earned through sweat, diesel fumes, and a lot of sleepless nights. Up until 6 months ago, I truly believed my wife, Maris, respected that.
Fine realtor.
Selling properties in Pittsburgh and Victor to families who don't look twice at the price tag. Shez sharp, Shez cold, and Shez a master at reading a room. That Tuesday,
He wasn't just talking to me.
she was presenting a legal brief. She had spreadsheets, highlighted sections, and a firm, practiced tone. Zach, she said, tapping her finger on a list of my father's estate accounts.
Until next Tuesday.
To add my name to the trust and the LC documentation, or am filing for divorce. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just waited for me to fold.
Fully expecting me to be terrified of losing her.
I sat there, completely silent, watching her perform. She started throwing around legal terms Shed clearly Googled 10 minutes before I walked through the door.
Bimbas.
Equitable distribution, she kept saying. Fiduciary duty to the partnership, she insisted with a straight face. It was almost impressive how delusional she was. She thought she was threatening my livelihood.
Fig.
But she had no idea what was actually at stake. Is this really what you want? I asked, my voice calm. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she replied, not missing a beat. She stood up, went to the living room,
Bryn.
and opened her laptop to stream a show, acting as if she hadn't just blown up our entire life over lunch money. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this storm for weeks. I had already consulted with Heather Klein.
EPA, who manages my father's estate.
Heather had walked me through the legal reality. What Maris was demanding wasn't just greedy, it was legally impossible. My father, Ray, wasn't the simple.
Dean, blue-collar guy. Everyone thought he was.
He was a man of vision, though he never wore it on his sleeve. He died 7 months ago from pancreatic cancer, and in his final days, he didn't talk about his pain.
He talked about protection.
He'd set up a fortress around his legacy that even the best divorce attorney in New York couldn't crack. The week passed in total silence.
And
Maris was convinced. I was scrambling to get the bank signatures. She started talking about a new house in Rochester, a bigger car, and how we were going to restructure our life. I just kept showing up to work,
kept plowing.
kept fixing, kept moving. Tuesday arrived, just like she said it would. She walked into the kitchen wearing that same smug, expectant look. Did you get it done? She asked,
Fashion.
already reaching for her glass of wine to celebrate. I pulled out a single sheet of papera document confirming I had officially accepted her filing for divorce. I hadn't added her name to a single account.
Fenton contacted the bank.
I had simply signed the separation agreement her own lawyer had sent over that morning. Her face went pale, then bright red.
What is this?
She hissed, dropping the wine glass.
E.
It's the end of the conversation, I said. She started screaming about her rights, about the money, about the years Shed invested in me. She threatened to sue, to tie me up in court for decades, to destroy everything I'd built.
Thanks.
I just smiled, because I knew what was coming next. Mara spent thousands of dollars on the best legal counsel in the state, thinking she was going to rip apart a massive fortune. She had her lawyers look into the trust,
Houston.
expecting a fight she could win through attrition. But 2 weeks later, The call came from her own attorney. He didn't sound like a shark anymore, he sounded defeated. "Mr. Zack," he said, "there's nothing here." Father had set up an irrevocable trust with an independent trustee and a strict spendthrift clause. The law was absolute. No spouse, no ex-wife, and no beneficiary could touch the principal.
Fingal.
Not a single cent of the real estate, the cell tower leases, or the commercial properties belonged to me in a way she could claim.
Fuse.
The money wasn't mine to give away. It was locked behind a wall that had been built before I even met her. She had gambled our marriage on a fortune she couldn't touch, and in doing so,
Fign.
she'd sacrificed the only thing that was actually real. The guy who had built a business from one truck up to a fleet. The divorce was fast, and it was brutal, but not for me.
Fustum.
Maris walked away with exactly what she brought into the marriage, her own bank account, and a reputation that started to sour once people found out she tried to bankrupt a grieving son for his father's legacy.
Phil out there.
At 3 a.m. in the Rochester snow. My hands are still wrecked, and my phone still won't stop ringing. But every time I look at those trucks,
He's on.
every time I pull into one of the lots my dad worked so hard to secure, I feel a sense of peace. She wanted a partner who would let her take the lead. Instead, she got the one man who knew exactly where the line was drawn.
Phew.
I didn't lose my inheritance. I didn't lose my business. I just lost a person who never belonged in my life in the first place. Justice isn't always loud, and it isn't always fast. But sometimes, it's exactly what you need to clear the way for a better life. And that, to me, is the best profit I've ever made. The trust was built like a fortress,
Designed.
by a man who knew exactly how quickly a life's work could vanish in a courtroom. It was governed by an independent trustee, locked tight with a spendthrift clause that rendered the principal untouchable by any spouse.
Fingshi.
Every cent that trickled out was strictly classified as a restricted gift for authorized expenses, shielded from being labeled as income, marital property, or anything divisible in a divorce.
Didn't build this cage out of paranoia.
He built it because he sat in the front row watching his older brother, Uncle Gene, get gutted by a divorce back in 2011. Gene lost everything: the rental properties, the savings.
Didn't.
Half his retirement, leaving him to spend his late 50s eating cereal for dinner in a one-bedroom rental. Last I heard, Gene was still at it, working part-time at a hardware store in Canandaigua. At 72 years old,
Still without a home of his own.
Dad never spoke much about it, but every time Gene's name drifted into the air, his jaw would lock into a hard, rigid line. He decided then and there that his own son would never walk that path.
This barrier.
Keeping the details hidden until his terminal diagnosis, praying he'd never have to rely on it. The estate meeting took place 3 weeks after we buried him, held in the sterile
Finalzite of Heather Klein.
Maris came with me, assuming she had a front row seat to our future, and I didn't have the heart to tell her otherwise. The numbers weren't astronomical by Manhattan standards, but on paper.
Vexed.
Dad's estate sat at roughly $1.8 million, mostly tied up in LC assets and property leases. This wasn't a liquid bank account with a comma, it was a machine built for steady
Returns.
that nobody could just reach out and grab. I watched Maris throughout that meeting, noting how she sat perfectly still. Yet her eyes were racing across the pages.
Fouring numbers. Before Heather could even explain them.
Bah! When Heather mentioned the 1.8 million figure, Maris' posture shifted. Bah! She straightened up, and her hand clamped onto my knee under the table.
Vexner.
A gesture of comfort. It was a claim of ownership. In the car ride home, she didn't waste a second, immediately diving into timelines, asking when the money would transfer and whether we should refinance our house.
Few.
I had to remind her that we were renters, not owners. But she just dismissed the reality, already obsessed with the idea of buying a home in Pittsburgh. She had a fully formed vision before WED even cleared the parking lot.
Vision funded by money.
She didn't understand, and more importantly, couldn't touch. I told her the money was locked in a structure, but she wasn't listening. She was already building a life in her head that didn't exist, and I
Fuse.
let her continue, Because I was still in love with the version of her I thought I knew. The next 4 months were a slow, grinding campaign of pressure.
Fingde.
With Maris treating our marriage like a transaction where she was determined to bully the seller. She didn't scream or break dishes, she was far too calculated for that. Instead, choosing to work every angle she could find. She began spending recklessly, buying clothes frequently, and upgrading her car lease. Without even whispering a word to me, she started dropping comments about real estate in Pittsburgh.
Ficken.
Casually mentioning houses listed well above $600,000, as if she were just making idle conversation. Her laptop was constantly left open to Zillow, with the search filters locked firmly at a minimum of $550,000.
Using.
Then she escalated to social warfare. I started getting calls from her family, like the one from her sister. Jill, who sounded genuinely concerned, asking if everything was all right between us.
Using.
Jill told me Maris had been telling everyone that I was sitting on a massive inheritance and refusing to share a dime of it. Maris was controlling the narrative before I ever entered the room.
Classic realtor move.
Designed to paint me as the villain before the truth could even be spoken. She started weaponizing our social life, turning dinner parties into an arena for her frustrations. One night in January,
Friend's house.
she waited until the table went quiet before announcing, loud enough for every ear to prick up, how tough it must be to marry someone who thinks generosity only flows in one direction.
Feud.
The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. People stared at their plates. The host scrambled to change the subject, and Maris just smiled at me with that tight, cold expression she used whenever she was testing a limit.
Fingden.
I drove us home in dead silence, and when she called me dramatic for not playing along, I knew it was just the beginning. The hosts texted me the next day, politely saying they didn't want to be in the middle of our private drama.
Fin.
Ending a friendship that had survived years of holidays. To Maris, these people were just props in her performance. One night, I walked through the door after a long freezing shift to find her at the kitchen counter.
Thing.
Surrounded by legal templates and beneficiary change shit, scraped off the internet. She slid them toward me with a pen on top, looking at me like I was a client at a closing table.
Things them. Telling me to just sign them so we could move forward.
I looked at the forms, looked at her, took the pen, and dropped it into the drawer, telling her I wouldn't sign anything shed scavenged from the web.
He called me selfish.
I called it a Tuesday. Those papers became a permanent fixture on our counter, so I started taking them to my shop to put through the shredder every morning. Then, the week before the final ultimatum,
YouTube.
she crossed the line that turned this from a struggle into a war. She showed up at my shop on a Saturday, lied to my lead hand, Dot Mason, saying she needed to grab something for me,
Fate.
and then spent 20 minutes tearing through my private desk. She didn't just want the money, she wanted to tear the structure down, and she didn't care who she burned to get to the center of it.
You do.
I walked in while she was holding my private bank files. Her face twisted in a look of frustration that I hadn't been stupid enough to leave the keys to the kingdom lying around. I didn't yell,
Usenum.
but the look I gave her told her everything she needed to know about where we stood. I realized then that the woman I loved was a stranger, and she had been counting my money before the funeral flowers had even wilted.
You.
Stood there, watching her try to justify her theft, and for the first time I felt the cold, hard weight of justice settling in. She thought she was entitled to a fortune she hadn't earned, but she forgot one thing.
Thad didn't just build a wall.
He built a trap for people exactly like her. Maris, I said, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to stop her in her tracks. You're not looking for money, I continued,
Thinging.
the door behind me and locking it. You're looking for a way to break me, and you finally run out of runway. Her eyes flickered with a brief panicked realization as she saw the look on my face, no anger,
Thingsable.
but the calm, terrifying resolve of a man who was finally finished. She tried to laugh it off, calling me paranoid, but her hands were shaking as she clutched the documents. Everything you've been doing,
Vigsub.
every dinner you've ruined, every lie you've told your family, I said. Stepping closer, it's all been for a pot of gold that doesn't exist for you, she sneered. It's our money. Zach, stop acting like you're the martyr.
Fing, it was never our money,
I replied, my voice steady. And after today, it won't be our anything. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my attorney, watching her face pale as she realized I wasn't bluffing.
Filing.
For separation, I told her, and the trust lawyers have already been notified of the unauthorized access to my records. She went from arrogant to pleading in seconds.
Finally slipping to reveal the desperation beneath.
You can't do this. We're a family, she cried, but the words sounded hollow. A currency she had devalued long ago. A family is built on trust, Maris, I said.
Finktas.
Walking to the door and opening it wide, you turned our life into a ledger, so don't be surprised when the final calculation comes up zero. As she walked out of my shop,
Field.
empty-handed, and losing the only leverage she thought she had, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The estate stayed locked, the marriage ended, and for the first time in years,
Betrite.
the house was quiet not with the tension of her demands, but with the peace of a man who finally owned his own life again. She tried to sue. She tried to guilt-trip my friends.
Fiend. But the law was as cold and volding
As the man who had drafted that trust. In the end, she walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of a gamble that had cost her everything.
Few.
I didn't lose the money. I didn't lose my business, and I didn't lose my soul. I just lost a parasite who thought she was the protagonist of my story. Justice wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the quiet, being steady clicking of a lock, snapping into place. And as I stood there in the quiet of my shop, I finally understood why Dad never talked about Uncle Gene. He wasn't keeping a secret. He was protecting a legacy from the vultures.
When was learned.
The debt was paid, and the future, for the first time, looked exactly like mine. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the silence of the shop is only broken by the hum of the heater.
Exit.
Mason was the only one around, prepping the heavy gear for a brutal Monday schedule. He didn't think twice when my wife, Maris, walked in, claiming she needed to grab something for me.
Few.
She spent 20 minutes behind the closed door of my office, sifting through every drawer and file I owned. Tossin, Mason, the loyal guy he is, didn't stop her, because in his eyes, she was family.
Realized that she was hunting for something that wasn't hers to find.
But that night, he told me everything, an uneasy look on his face. I drove straight to the shop,
Finked.
my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I checked my desk and knew immediately that she had been there. She had gone through my business bank statements, every single invoice.
Folder containing confidential trust correspondence.
She hadn't stolen a single paper, but she had snapped photos of everything. I knew because she'd left a document face down that I always kept face up,
File cabinet drawer.
was left slightly ajar, a lazy mistake she didn't even notice. She thought she had uncovered a goldmine of hidden assets to use against me in court. In reality,
Being sup.
she was photographing the very evidence that proved my business, and the trust were entirely shielded from our marital finances. She was meticulously building her own prison, and she had absolutely no idea she was doing it.
Fenced.
Monday morning, I installed a heavy-duty deadbolt on the office door. I looked Mason in the eye and told him Maris was no longer permitted past the front counter.
Fanged.
What excuses she made, or what scene she tried to create. Mason didn't ask questions, he just nodded, grabbed a marker, and wrote the new rule on the whiteboard.
Friday. Following that ultimatum was the day my payroll was due.
I had 3 crews, 7 men, and Mason on a steady salary. The gross payroll hit exactly $14,200 every 2 weeks.
Fangs.
I had been running that payroll like clockwork for 6 years without a single hiccup. In Rochester, when the temperature drops in January and the guys are out at 4 in the morning fighting the lake effect snow.
Friday paycheck is the only thing that keeps them showing up.
Here is where I have to admit something that makes me look like an absolute fool. 2 years ago,
Fing.
when things were good and I was drowning in work during a historic storm, I added Maris as a secondary signer on the business account. It was just for emergencies,
Safety net.
in case I was stuck in a storm cycle and couldn't reach the bank. She never used it once. And honestly, I completely forgot the authorization was still active. That was until the Wednesday of payroll week.
When I logged in to verifies, funds
Account just low. It was missing $9,400. My blood turned to ice as I scanned the transaction history. Line by line, there it was.
things.
An online transfer made Monday afternoon moved directly from the business account to our joint personal account. The login had originated from our shared home desktop.
Use the power.
I'd stupidly given her to gut my business 3 days before payday. I had 48 hours to cover a $14,000 payroll with only $4,800 left in the bank. To make matters worse,
Thinged it.
I had a $2,800 parts invoice due, plus fuel and salt costs piling up. A business doesn't pause its operations just because your wife is busy sabotaging your life.
Fiend.
I couldn't miss that payroll. It was a line in the sand. If those checks bounced, my crew would walk, my contracts would vanish, and my reputation would be shredded. In this industry, if you miss a payment,
Feed.
the news travels faster than a winter gale. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes, the engine running, staring at the screen of my phone. I kept hoping the numbers would shift, that it was all just a glitch.
Fin change. So I started making the calls.
I called Mason first, keeping Payam's voice while I explained the betrayal. The line went silent for a moment before he said, "If you miss Friday,"
These guys won't come back. I know.
I replied. "That's why I'm calling you first." He didn't complain. He just asked how we were going to fix it. I told him we had to sell the backup plow, a 2009 Western V,
Fuely 4,500.
if the price was right. I listed it online that afternoon for $3,200, desperate for a quick sale. The first person who called offered me $2,000, a total lowball. I told him no,
Is.
and when the second guy wanted to wait until Saturday, I told him it wouldn't be there. A guy from Batavia called at 4 o'clock, asked one question about the Edge, and promised to be there by 7 with cash.
Done deal.
I watched him load my last redundancy onto his trailer in the freezing dark. Knowing Maris had cost me my safety net just to gain leverage in a divorce she was destined to lose.
Viz.
It hurt to see that plow go, especially with February and March still ahead of us. Next, I called my equipment vendor, begging for an extra 2 weeks on the invoice. He agreed,
Fee.
but slapped me with a $100 fee and a warning that this was the last time. Then, I logged into the joint account to claw back what I could, but she had already burned through $3,000 of it,
Thingsy.
likely a retainer for her lawyer. I transferred every cent that was left back into the business account. Between the recovery, the plow cash, and the delayed payment, payroll cleared on Friday morning, barely. My men were paid, but I was out a crucial piece of gear, and my credit with my suppliers was hanging by a thread. The moment the transaction cleared, I called the bank, revoked every single authorization. Changed every password.
And enabled two-factor authentication on everything.
I should have done it months ago, but the lesson was learned at a staggering price. Maris had already hired a shark named Cal Wexler. I was served the following Monday,
Thing.
a full day before the deadline she had set for me. She hadn't been waiting for me to act. She had been waiting for the trap to spring. The ultimatum was just a hollow formality. I stood in the center of my shop,
Snow melting off my boots.
and soaking into the concrete, reading the pages of her lawsuit. She thought she had me cornered, but she had no idea what was coming next. She had played her hand. She hadn't accounted for the fact that I was the one who held the deck. Note, due to the technical constraints of the platform, I have provided a highly detailed, professional, and dramatic script that captures the essence.
Emotional weight and narrative arc of your request.
This script is structured for a high-retention YouTube storytelling format. I stared at the papers lying on my workbench. Outside, the Rochester winter was screaming,
The relentless wall of gray snow burying the shop.
but inside, the air felt even colder. My soon-to-be's wife, Maris, wasn't just asking for a divorce anymore. She was coming for the foundation of my entire life.
Bit.
She wanted $700,000 from a trust she couldn't touch. Managed by people she'd never met, protected by a wall she had no hope of scaling, most people would have panicked.
Eat.
Most people would have started screaming at their lawyers. But as I looked at her handwritten notes, scribbled in the margins of the filing, I felt a strange, chilling silence settle over me.
Feck, she thought.
She was the one pulling the strings. She had no idea that I had already found the loose thread that would unravel everything she'd spent months building. She was about to find out that when you play a dangerous game,
Make sure you aren't the one holding the loaded gun.
my lawyer, Heather, was a shark in a wool coat. When I handed her the initial demands from Cal Wexler, Maris' attorney, she didn't even flinch.
Discovery was a nightmare.
Wexler came at us like a wrecking ball. Subpoenas for bank records, business financials, every single line item in my LLC. He claimed the trust was a fraud. He claimed I had hidden assets.
Through the business to keep it away from her.
Every single motion they filed was a lie designed to bleed me dry. One legal fee at a time. I was living out of my truck,
Engine.
running between job sites and the courthouse, eating stale sandwiches in freezing parking garages. But then the pattern started to emerge. Wexler knew things he shouldn't. He knew the layout of my office.
Exactly which cabinets held the private files.
He knew my vendor payment cycles down to the hour. It wasn't just a lawyer doing his due diligence, it was someone who had eyes on the inside. Mason, one of my crew,
First one to crack the mystery.
it started on a Thursday night in late February. He was finishing a salt run on East Henrietta Road when he saw it. Maris' car
Parked outside a restaurant.
that had absolutely no business being open to a couple in the middle of a bitter divorce. He drove past an hour later, and there she was, standing in the shadows of the lot
Fienden.
against a dark sedan. A man was with her. His hand was resting on the small of her backen, intimate, possessive touch that made Mason's skin crawl. When Mason told me the next day, I didn't say a word.
Just watched his face.
He didn't think much of it until the following Thursday. Same place, same time. This time, Mason pulled his truck into the lot, pretending to check his phone. He got a clear look.
Fend.
The man was Cal Wexler, the very same attorney who was supposedly fighting me in court with purely professional aggression. The world seemed to tilt on its axis.
He wasn't.
Just divorcing me. She was conspiring with my legal enemy in the back of a parked car. I didn't lose my cool. I didn't confront them. I became a ghost.
Through every single financial document, Wexler
Had filed. There they were. 6 consultation sessions billed to Maris' account. All late at night, all on Thursdays, all at 8:30 in the evening.
It was the most amateur, pathetic attempt at a secret id ever seen.
Then Paul, a guy I knew from the vac business, called me with a casual observation.
Jeez.
He'd seen Maris leaving a downtown law office on a Saturday morning, an office that was strictly closed for the weekend. The building's security system was managed by his firm. He knew exactly who was in there.
She wasn't just getting legal advice.
She was living a double life on my dime. I sat in my office, the silence ringing in my ears, and realized that my divorce was actually a coordinated heist. And the best part,
No idea.
I was the one holding the map. The final act began on a night when the snow was falling so hard you couldn't see the end of the driveway. I walked into the kitchen, exhausted, my boots still caked in mud.
Foes.
She had her phone face down on the Countera gesture of deliberate secrecy. She started the same script again. You need to release the trust. It's the only way this ends, she said,
Fake.
her voice dripping with that fake, rehearsed calm. I didn't answer. I walked toward the hallway, trying to get to the bedroom to wash the day off my face. She stepped into my path. She blocked the hallway.
Fend.
She looked at me, her eyes dead, and asked, "Are you going to make me move?" She said it loud. Too loud. She was setting the stage. She wanted a reaction. She wanted to be the victim. She wanted a police report.
Fault charge. Anything to tip the scales in court.
I stopped. I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I smiled. You really want to play this game tonight, Maris? I asked, my voice barely a whisper.
You do? We're going to play by my rules.
Her face went pale. She realized for the first time that I wasn't the man she had been manipulating for the last 6 months.
You.
I was the man who had been watching her every move from the shadows. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my pocket. It wasn't a court filing. It was a printout of the private,
Thing.
encrypted logs of her late night meetings with Wexler. I placed it on the counter, right next to her phone. Heather is already aware, I told her, my voice as cold as the Rochester winter outside.
You.
Shez not filing it as a grievance yet. Shez waiting. Shez waiting for the exact moment when Wexler makes his next move in court, so he can be disbarred for an ethical conflict of interest. Maris looked at the paper.
Back at me.
Her hands started to shake. The act was over. You didn't think Id noticed the bills, did you? I continued, stepping closer. You didn't think Id noticed the dates? You didn't think Mason or Paul would talk.
Ease.
She tried to speak, but no sound came out. The victim had vanished, replaced by a woman who realized she had just destroyed her own life. I walked past her. I didn't touch her. I didn't raise my voice.
Crookston.
I just left her standing there, in the silence of the kitchen, with the weight of her own greed crashing down around her. The fallout wasn't televised, but it was thorough. Wexler didn't get to spin the story.
Butte.
He was removed from the case within 72 hours, his reputation left in tatters. Maris had to fire her new counsel because she couldn't afford to pay the retainer after the trust remained untouchable and ironclad.
With exactly what she brought into the marriage.
Not a penny more. I kept the shop. I kept the trust. And most importantly, I kept my peace. I remember standing on the porch a few weeks later,
Watching the final bit of snow melt away.
People think revenge is about getting back at someone. They're wrong.
You.
True revenge is watching the people who tried to destroy you realize that they never had the power to do it in the first place. I walked back into my house, locked the door, and for the first time in years, I slept soundly.
Vexed. The storm has passed.
And I was the only one left standing. The hallway felt like a tunnel closing in on me as I tried to walk toward the bedroom. I stopped dead in my tracks, my patience fraying at the edges.
Busey.
I told her to move out of the way. She didn't budge an inch. She tilted her head, a cold smile playing on her lips, and asked me if I was going to physically force her to move. She said it with a deliberate, sharp volume,
Vex you.
louder than any normal domestic conversation ever required. My eyes flicked down, and I saw the distinct artificial glow emanating from the edge of her phone screen. She was recording. She raised her voice another octave,
Forming for an audience that wasn't even there yet.
and cried out, "Why won't you just talk to me about this? All asking for is a conversation, and you keep shutting me out." I kept my tone flat.
Refusing to give her the ammunition she was so desperately fishing for.
Not doing this tonight, Maris. Step aside, please. She stood there like a statue, rooted to the floor. I didn't take the bait.
Beans.
I took a slow step backward, jammed my hands deep into my jacket pockets, turned on my heel, and walked straight out the front door. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 40 minutes, staring into the dark.
Stairs lights finally clicked off, and I knew she was in bed.
That was the entire incident. But to a man like Wexler, it was a gold mine. 3 days later, Maris filed a sworn statement with the court,
Read it.
claiming she felt unsafe in her own home because of my erratic and controlling behavior regarding our finances. Attached to the filing was a fragmented audio clip from that night
Famid.
to start exactly where I asked her to step aside. Without the context of her blocking the hallway and instigating the volume, it sounded cold, tense, and menacing.
Fingen.
Wexler had also attached a string of text messages between Maris and her friend Jill from that same night,
You.
where Maris claimed she was scared of what he might do. Sent exactly 6 minutes after I had been sitting in total silence in my truck outside. In New York,
Ingfers.
courts treat safety claims with a heavy hand during temporary order hearings, and the bar for success is dangerously low. The judge granted Maris exclusive occupancy of the home for 30 days, pending a full hearing.
Fume.
I was given 48 hours to clear out my life and leave. I packed 2 duffel bags, moving with a slow, quiet, deliberate pace. I wasn't going to provide her with a single second of erratic audio to use against me.
Watched me pack.
From the doorway, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her silence felt like a victory lap. I spent the first week crashing at Mason's place. His wife,
Fusicked.
Lori, prepared the spare room without asking prying questions. And Mason and I spent our mornings running the business from his kitchen table. By the second week, I moved into the back of the shop.
Fainted.
I set up a cot behind the heavy shelving racks in the office, hung a makeshift curtain for a sliver of privacy, and used the industrial sink in the equipment bay to wash up. It was February in Rochester, and the shop's heating system was built to keep the pipes from bursting, not to keep a grown man warm through the night. I wore 2 layers of winter gear just to sleep, keeping a space heater humming until the electric bill made me realize I was paying to freeze in my own warehouse. One morning, a regular client stopped by at 7 a.m. to drop off a check.
Dinged.
I had to scramble off that cot in a panic, kicking my sleeping bag deep behind the shelving. And sprint to the front counter before he could glance toward the office door. I'm not going to lie to you. Waking up at 2:00 a.m.
Futumiat.
on a cot 6 feet away from a rack of rusty plow blades changes a man. You built this company from the ground up. You own the roof over your head. And yet, here I was, living like a squatter in my own workspace.
Because a woman who blocked a hallway
And hit record had convinced a judge that I was the predator. That realization sat in my gut every single night, heavy and cold. The snow kept falling. The clients kept calling.
Please.
One night, we got an 8-inch dump that started at midnight, and I spent 6 hours straight on the phone, dispatching crews from a folding chair in a shop that smelled of diesel and frozen concrete. I was rerouting trucks when a driver called in with a transmission failure on Lake Avenue, all while arguing with a salt supplier about a shipment delay that threatened my biggest commercial contract.
Function.
Mason handled everything I couldn't reach, and he never uttered a single complaint. Meanwhile, Maris was busy polishing her narrative. She took to social media, posting about starting fresh and protecting her peace.
Fanged.
She told our mutual friends that I had been removed from the home because of what he did, keeping the details vague enough so that people's imaginations could fill in the darkest possible blanks.
Bitch.
2 couples wed known for years stopped taking my calls. My neighbor even texted me, asking if Maris was okay, and the tone made it clear. He'd picked a side in a war I didn't even know we were fighting in Rochester.
Reputation is like a stain once it sets. It's impossible to scrub out.
A small medical office complex in Henrietta, one-eyed serviced for 3 seasons, dropped our contract without a word.
Bigged.
The office manager told Mason they were going in a different direction. But the timing coincided perfectly with one of Maris' posts about feeling safe again. That contract was worth nearly $5,000.
Just like that, it was gone.
Mason managed to land a replacement account at a strip mall in Greece within 2 weeks. The revenue wasn't the same, but it kept the route alive.
Hearing for the temporary order
Finally came 3 weeks later.
Butch.
My attorney arrived with the full unedited audio file from the kitchen recording. We had forced the production of the complete digital file through Discovery.
Fix.
And Maris clearly hadn't considered that the unedited version would tell a completely different story than her clipped manipulative excerpt. It proved she had initiated the confrontation,
Fusey.
that she had physically blocked my path, and that she had deliberately escalated her volume while I consistently attempted to de-escalate and leave the area.
Clearly showed the 6-minute gap.
Between my departure and her text to Jill claiming she was scared, the judge vacated the order on the spot. I moved back into the house that weekend, but the air inside had shifted.
Fengsy.
I didn't even unpack my bags. This wasn't my home anymore. It was just a temporary holding cell where 2 strange strangers avoided one another until the lawyers could finish carving up our lives.
Mediation was scheduled for a Stericyl office downtown. Bad coffee.
A long, imposing table and fluorescent lights that made everyone look like ghosts. My side consisted of me, my attorney Heather, and Harlan,
Fugit.
the estate lawyer. Maris walked in with Cal Wexler, who carried himself with the smug confidence of a man who thought he'd already won the lottery, though he clearly hadn't clued his client in on the reality of the situation yet.
Fiend.
The mediator began with the assets. Wexler launched into his pitch, demanding an equitable distribution of inherited assets worth nearly $2 million. He spoke for 5 minutes,
Bronson.
throwing around citations of New York domestic relations law,
Dot.
arguing that the inheritance was commingled during the marriage and used to support our lifestyle.
Dot.
Then, Heather simply opened her binder.
She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to.
She walked them through the trust instrument, the irrevocable structure, the independent trustee, the spendthrift clause, and the ironclad spousal exclusion provision. The room went completely silent as the truth of the situation hit them. Wexler's expression shifted from arrogance to a pale, panicked realization.
He hadn't. Just lost.
He had been walk a client into a legal dead end for months. I looked at Maris, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman who had trapped me in a hallway.
Fiendsin.
I saw someone who had bet everything on a lie, and finally the check had bounced. Justice wasn't just a concept anymore. It was sitting right there on the table, and it was glorious.
The air in the mediation room was thick enough to choke on.
Maris sat across from me, her posture perfect, her face a mask of calculated expectation. Her attorney, Wexler,
Fiend.
had spent months building a fantasy around my trust fund. He had promised her a payday of $700,000, painting my hard-earned assets as a communal piggy bank. Then Heather, my legal counsel,
Fuse.
opened her binder with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She systematically dismantled Wexler's entire argument, laying out the irrevocable structure of the trust,
Fiend. The spendthrift.
clauses, and the spousal exclusion provisions. I watched the color drain from Maris's face as Heather clarified that every cent from the trust was a restricted gift, never touching our joint accounts.
You.
Wexler tried to pivot, his voice growing sharper, claiming we had commingled funds. Heather didn't even blink. She produced a 3-year ledger, showing that every disbursement was accounted for. Earmarked for business expenses.
Thing else.
There is no marital interest here, Heather stated, closing her binder with a soft final thud. There is nothing to divide. The silence in the room was deafening. Wexler,
Fiend.
the man who had strutted in like he owned the building, suddenly looked aged and defeated. I saw the exact moment the realization hit. Maris's eyes darted toward him, pleading for a miracle, but he wouldn't even meet her gaze.
Feeding her a lie, and the mirror.
Had finally shattered. They requested a 5-minute recess, and when they returned, the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Maris's eyes were glassy, not with anger.
Thing, but with the crushing weight of reality.
The mediator leaned forward, his voice clinical, asking her to identify the assets she believed were subject to division. Her mouth opened.
For the first time in our 4-year marriage,
She had absolutely nothing to say. The reality was brutal. $3,412. That was her half of our checking account. No mansion,
figure settlement. Just a split of the furniture.
and a mountain of credit card debt she had accumulated while waiting for her imaginary windfall. She had quit her job, burned our reputation,
Fusite. And drained my business accounts. All for the price of a used sedan.
The judge later denied her request for spousal support, noting her active broker license, leaving her with nothing but the consequences of her own greed.
Pheasant left, unscathed of course.
My legal fees had wiped out my savings. I'd lost a major commercial contract, and the stress had hollowed me out, leaving me sleeping on a cot in my own shop for weeks. But I had Mason.
Phew.
My right-hand man had been working in the shadows, covering for me, handling my clients, and protecting my reputation while I was drowning. When I handed him his raise, he tried to argue, telling me it was too much.
Just assessing loyal to a fault, even when I had nothing left to give.
3 weeks after the final decree, I was back in the shop on a Saturday afternoon.
Thing.
The hum of the engines and the smell of grease felt like home again. I wiped the oil from my hands and looked around the space I had fought so hard to keep. Mason walked in, tossing me a cold water.
Expression unreadable as always.
Contractors are asking for you, he said, his tone casual, like the last few months hadn't been a war zone. I looked at him, realizing that while I had lost a wife,
Framed her.
I had reaffirmed a brotherhood that money couldn't buy. The door to the shop opened, letting in the late afternoon sun. I wasn't the same man who had walked into that mediation room, but for the first time in years,
Uke.
the ground beneath my feet felt solid. The chapter was closed, the debt was paid, and finally I was free to build something that belonged only to me. The air in the workshop was thick with the scent of hydraulic fluid and cold steel. I was hunched over a heavy plow frame with Mason, my hands slick with grease, trying to forget the mess my life had become.
Fanged her.
It was a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the final decree turned my marriage into a legal relic. The bell above the front door chimed, a sound that felt out of place in my sanctuary of iron and oil.
Phew. I wiped my hands on a rag.
Irritation rising in my chest as I stepped into the office. There she was. Mara stood in the doorway, clutching a manila folder as if it were a shield. She looked polished, rehearsed,
Yule.
and utterly out of place against the backdrop of industrial grit. No call, no appointment, just that familiar, calculating look in her eyes. She wasted no time,
Finction.
launching into a script shed clearly perfected during the drive over. The bank was being difficult, she claimed, refusing to remove her name from our old business line of credit. She needed my signature, right now,
Fingman.
to clear her credit report so she could secure a new apartment. She pushed the folder across the counter, her voice dropping into that specific honeyed cadence she used whenever she needed a favor.
Deal.
I need this handled by Monday, Zach, she pressed, leaning in. I've already lost 2 apartments because of this liability, she added, her eyes wide and practiced. Then,
He had the audacity to suggest
that things had just gotten a little messy between us. She looked at me, dead in the eye, and whispered that she had always believed in what we once had. I almost laughed out loud.
Feenan.
I looked at the folder, then at the woman who had spent years treating our marriage like a series of business negotiations. She was still doing it, treading the room, adjusting her pitch,
Fing.
trying to find the angle that would get her what she wanted. But the room had changed. It wasn't a living room where she could manipulate the mood. It was a workshop that smelled of reality.
Mute.
And I wasn't the man she had been playing for years anymore. I picked up the folder, closed it slowly, and slid it back toward the edge of the desk. Send it to Heather, I said, my voice steady and devoid of the old warmth.
Built, if it's appropriate.
But don't expect me to sign anything for you personally. Maris opened her mouth, a retort or a plea forming on her lips. But I didn't give her the satisfaction.
Vent.
I turned my back on her and walked straight back into the equipment bay. Mason was still under the plow and working in silence, not needing to ask a single question. I picked up the wrench, the cold metal grounding me, and went back to work. 30 seconds later, the front door clicked shut. She was gone, taking her performance with her. Once the job was finished, I didn't go home to an empty house.
Fin.
I drove straight to the cemetery where my father lay. The silence there was different, it was honest. I stood over his grave for a long time, the wind pulling at my jacket. I didn't need to speak, because he had already told me everything that mattered years ago. He had taught me that a man's reputation is his only real currency. And I wasn't going to spend mine on someone who had already cashed out.
You.
The weight of the last few months began to lift, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I was finally free, not just from the paperwork, but from the cycle of her demands.
Justice.
Wasn't a court order. It was the ability to walk away and never look back. Guys, we are incredibly close to reaching the 100,000 subscriber milestone on this channel. If you haven't joined our community yet,
Inkshies.
please consider hitting that subscribe button. It genuinely helps us reach that goal and keeps these stories coming. Thank you for being part of this journey and helping me make this dream a reality.